It all started with what seemed like a simple land dispute, but quickly spiraled into one of the most shocking HOA battles you'll ever hear about. Imagine owning over 3,000 acres of land that had been in your family for generations, only to discover one day that your local homeowners association had quietly and illegally sold pieces of it, acting as if they had any right to. At first, it felt like a bad joke. But the paperwork was real. The signatures were forged. And the HOA board was already celebrating their so-called victory. I wasn't just losing land. I was losing history, memories, and the future of my family's legacy. Every acre had a story. And now it was being carved up and handed out as if it were theirs to take. When I confronted them, the arrogance on their faces made it clear they thought they were untouchable. They believed their connections and money gave them the power to steal. What they didn't realize was that I had just as much fight in me as they had greed in them. So I dug deeper, consulted legal experts, and started piecing together a strategy that would not only expose their lies, but turn the tables completely. And when the opportunity finally came, I found a way to strike back in a way no one saw coming. They took my land. But I discovered something they valued even more: an entire lake system worth millions that they thought was theirs forever. What happened next would shake the entire community, and it all began with a single signature. The truth is, my land was never just dirt and trees. Those 3,000 acres were the backbone of my family for decades. My grandfather farmed it, my father hunted on it, and I always believed I'd pass it down one day. The HOA, however, saw it as nothing more than a profit opportunity. They whispered about future developments, new luxury homes, and private amenities they could market as exclusive. In their eyes, my land wasn't heritage, it was dollar signs. What made it worse was how sneaky they were. Instead of coming to me directly, they slipped false claims into county records and acted as though the HOA had controlling rights over land that was never part of their community. By the time I found out, pieces of my property had already been listed under their name. Neighbors looked at me with confusion, some even asking why I gave up the land so easily. That was when I realized how carefully the HOA had spun their story. Behind the scenes, the board members treated themselves like kings. They sat around in meetings boasting about the expansion they'd pull off, as if they were building an empire. But arrogance often blinds people, and in their confidence, they overlooked details that would soon become their downfall. As I pieced everything together, I started hearing more about their prized possession, the massive lake system they loved to show off at every HOA gathering. It wasn't just a pond or two. It was an interconnected series of lakes valued at over $12 million. And while they thought it was safely under their control, I began to see a loophole that could change everything. The deeper I looked, the more I realized this wasn't just about greed, it was about power. The HOA had convinced themselves they were the gatekeepers of the entire community, even beyond their legal boundaries. They weren't content with managing neighborhood bylaws or collecting dues. They wanted control over everything, from my farmland to the water that fed the town. It was like they were running their own private kingdom, using intimidation and paperwork as their weapons. I started talking to people quietly, folks who had lived under the HOA's thumb for years. Stories began pouring out. One neighbor told me how they were fined thousands of dollars for keeping a shed the HOA didn't approve of, even though the shed was built long before the neighborhood existed. Another said the board had bullied them into selling a strip of their property so they could expand a trail system. The pattern was clear. If the HOA wanted something, they found a way to take it. At the same time, I began digging into the history of the lake system. On paper, it looked like the HOA had total ownership. They boasted about it in newsletters, used it to attract buyers, and even held fishing tournaments on it. But when I traced back the original deeds, a different story started to emerge. The water rights were more complicated than they wanted anyone to know, hidden in county files. I found language that suggested the HOA's claim wasn't as airtight as they believed, while they celebrated their growing empire. I kept piecing together the cracks in their foundation, and the more I uncovered, the more I realized the lake might become the very weapon I needed to fight back. Every day that passed, the pressure grew heavier. The HOA moved fast, carving up my land on paper while parading around like they had already won. They sent smug letters, flaunted their new boundaries, and even hinted that I should just accept the loss because fighting them would cost more than it was worth. That was the moment I knew they had no idea what was coming. Behind the scenes, I had gathered enough evidence to show how they had twisted county filings, forged signatures, and bullied neighbors. But instead of rushing to court right away, I waited. I wanted them comfortable, distracted by their latest project, the expansion around their prized lake system. They were pouring time and money into it, convinced it would become their crown jewel. What they didn't know was that I had already discovered the weak spot in their claim, the one loophole that could flip everything upside down. The more I studied the lake deeds, the more it felt like holding a ticking time bomb. If I made one wrong move, the HOA would cover their tracks. But if I waited too long, they'd finish selling off pieces of my land. The tension was unbearable. Neighbors began whispering about what I was planning, though I told no one the full story. Even my closest friends could see the strain in my face as I weighed every decision. And then, at the height of their arrogance, the HOA announced a massive event at the lake, a celebration of their success. That was the moment I knew the stage was set. The next move would decide everything. Just when I thought I had the upper hand, a new twist surfaced that made everything more dangerous. Days before the HOA's big lake celebration, I received a thick envelope in the mail. Inside were fresh documents, proof that the board had pushed through yet another set of filings, this time claiming easement rights across parts of my land to protect access to the lakes. It was a bold move, almost desperate, and it told me one thing: they suspected I was closing in on them. This escalated the conflict in ways I hadn't expected. By tying my land directly to their lake system, they had essentially tangled the two battles together. If I didn't act carefully, I could lose not just my acres, but also the chance to challenge their control over the water. It felt like they were tightening a noose, trying to corner me into a position where they thought I'd have no choice but to surrender. But what they underestimated was how fragile their empire really was. I uncovered internal HOA emails, leaked by someone on the inside, that showed cracks in their unity. Some board members were starting to worry, questioning whether the filings would hold up in court if challenged. Others pushed forward recklessly, blinded by greed. That division was my opening, and I knew I had to use it before they closed ranks again. The celebration at the lake was only days away, and now the stakes were higher than ever. They were doubling down, and I was preparing to strike from an angle they never expected. Everything was building to a breaking point, and there was no turning back. The day of the HOA's Grand Lake celebration finally arrived, and it felt like the perfect storm. Hundreds of people gathered under white tents with music, banners, and speeches about growth and community pride. The board members stood at the center, smiling like they had conquered the world. But while they raised their glasses, I was already filing the paperwork that would undo everything they had built. Using the loophole I had uncovered, I legally challenged their claim to the lake system. The original deeds proved that the water rights had never fully transferred to the HOA, and because they had tied those rights to my land through their reckless filings, the lake system now fell under my control. Within hours, the same county office they had manipulated recognized my ownership. While the board was still celebrating, word spread like wildfire: their $12 million jewel was gone. The shock hit them hard. The board froze, scrambling for answers. as neighbors whispered in disbelief. My land was secured, their forged filings exposed, and their empire crumbled in front of the very people they had tried to impress. For the first time, the power they flaunted slipped right through their hands. But just when I thought the battle was over, the unexpected happened. The insider who had leaked the emails stepped forward publicly, revealing that they had kept even more damaging evidence proof of years of hidden financial mismanagement inside the HOA. What began as a land fight suddenly turned into a full-blown investigation that reached far beyond me. I had won back my land and claimed their lakes. But the ripple effect was only just beginning. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the HOA's downfall spread across the entire community. County officials launched a full investigation, and what they uncovered shocked everyone. Years of shady deals, hidden fees, and backroom agreements came to light. Homeowners who once felt powerless now had their voices heard, and for the first time, people realized just how much the board had taken advantage of them. What started as my fight for 3,000 acres had turned into a reckoning for the entire neighborhood. As for me, the land was finally secured back in my name, safe from their tricks. Walking those acres again, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't just about the soil or the boundaries, it was about protecting the legacy of my family and proving that no amount of greed could erase it. The lakes, now legally mine, became more than a victory. They were a symbol of how persistence and the truth can overturn even the most powerful lies. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet began thanking me, not just for standing up for myself, but for exposing what so many had been too afraid to challenge. Some even offered to help restore parts of the land that had been neglected while the HOA tried to claim it. It reminded me that community isn't built on control or intimidation, it's built on trust. Looking back, the fight was exhausting. But it proved something important. No one is too small to stand against corruption. My land, my lakes, and my story became a reminder that when you protect what's rightfully yours, you're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for everyone who believes in fairness.